Chapter 21 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lillis. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 21. Word and Tone in Bach. Part 1. The relation of Bach's music to its text is the most intimate that can be imagined. Footnote. See also Arnold Schering's interesting essay, Bach's Textbehandlung, in which the poetic element in Bach's music is described for the first time, and very finely and searchingly, and André Pirot's monumental study, L'Esthétique de J.S. Bach, which confirms and completes in the most gratifying way the conclusions arrived at in the present volume. End footnote. This is evident even in externalities. The structure of his musical phrase does not merely fit more or less the structure of the poetic phrase, but is identical with it. In this respect we may contrast Bach with Handel. In the latter, the musical period of a long verbal passage consists of separate fragments joined together in the most masterly way, the verbal phrase, however, having to surrender something of its own natural form in order to accommodate itself to that of the music. There always results a certain antagonism between the rhythm of the two factors. We get the impression that if we were to let a Handelian theme fall to the ground, the tone melody and the word melody would separate under the shock, whereas a Bach phrase would remain unbroken and inseparable, his musical phrase being only the verbal phrase recast in tone. His music is indeed not so much melodic as declamatory. He is what Guido Adler maintains Wagner is, a product of the great music of the Renaissance. The melodic impression his phrases make on us is due to his clear and consummate sense of form. Though he thought declamatorily, he could not help writing melodically. A vocal theme of Bach's is a declamatorily conceived phrase that by accident, as if by a marvel perpetually repeated, assumes melodic form, whether it be a recitative, an arioso, an aria, or a chorus. His texts, regarded from the standpoint of form, were as unapt for music as any that could be imagined. A biblical verse does not fall into any musical period, not even a verbal one, for it has its origin not in a rhythmical feeling, but in the necessities of translation. It was no better with the original text given him by his librettists. These again have no inner unity, being painfully pieced together out of the reminiscences of the Bible and the hymn books. But when we read the same sentences in Bach's music, they all at once fall into definite musical phrases. The declamatory unit of tone and word in Bach reminds us of Wagner. While, however, it is self-evident in the latter, the verbal phrase itself being musically conceived, so that the music only adds the intervals, as it were, in Bach the phenomenon is more wonderful. The music seems to confer a higher vital power on the words, divests them of their lowly associations, and shows them in their true form. This marvel is so perpetually repeated in the cantatas and passions, that we come to regard it as a matter of course. But the more deeply we penetrate into Bach, the more we are filled with the ever-renewed and ever-increasing astonishment that the thoughtful soul feels in the presence of those daily occurrences of nature that are at the same time the greatest marvels. If we have once absorbed a biblical verse in Bach's setting of it, we can never again conceive it in any other rhythm. It is impossible for anyone who knows the St. Matthew's Passion to run over in his mind the sacramental words of the evening communion, without consciously or unconsciously giving the words the accents and duration that they have in Bach's declamation. No one who knows the cantata, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, No. 61, can ever think of the Siehe, ich stehe vor der Tür und klopfe an, apart from Bach's phrasing of it. Even if he has forgotten the actual intervals, the musical ground plan of the passage has become, after several hearings, so much the plan of the passage itself, that it is impossible to think of the one without the other. It would be incorrect to suppose that in every good musical setting the music has the same power of persistence. It is not found in the same degree in anyone but Wagner, not even in Schubert. The extraordinary thing is that in Bach's music the reminiscence depends less on the intervals than on the accents and quantities of the declamation itself, although of course his themes are so characteristic and drastic in their intervals that they are memorable from this side as well. One of the most remarkable examples of his declamation is in the arioso-like opening recitative of the cantata Gleich wie der Regen und Schnee vom Himmel fällt, No. 18. The nearly equal divisions of the original passage are gathered up by the music into one great unified phrase that resolves and obliterates, as if by magic, all the rigidities of the verbal passage, giving us the impression that the poetic thought has waited for centuries for this music in order to reveal itself in its true plastic outline. Even when Bach's music is more aria-like in structure, it still retains this purely declamatory quality. Recite, for example, the first aria of the cantata, Selig ist der Mann, Number 57, strictly according to the quantities and the accents of the music, without for a moment considering the intervals, and you will get an idea of how veracious Bach's musical declamation is. If the verse he is setting has rhyme and a regular length of line, he passes over these and fastens upon the inner form of the passage. His musical phrase is never dominated by the recurrence of the rhyme. In the text of the aria in the St. Matthew Passion, Gerne will ich mich bequemen, Kreuz und Becher anzunehmen, trink ich doch dem Heiland nach. It seems almost impossible for music to rise superior to the rhyme. Bach succeeds, however, by his distribution of the accents and the intervals, in so diverting our attention from it that we are unconscious of it when it is properly sung. The first ich must be accented as the music indicates, and as its relation to the previous arioso, der Heiland fällt, obviously demands. The phrase goes thus. It is not Bach's fault if many of our singers bring out here the poet's line divisions and rhymes instead of Bach's musical phrase. Anyone who goes through the separate voices of Nun ist das Heil und die Kraft, number 50, will discover that Bach phrases declamatorily even when he seems to be merely writing fugal parts. Effective as his method is, it does not always seem natural at first sight. Often, indeed, Bach's way of turning a passage into music seems quite unnatural. Rhythm, structure, accents, syllabic values, all give at first the impression of being wrong. The syllable that would ordinarily receive the main accent is, if possible, merged and lost in the shadow of the unaccented part of the bar. Another one of no value at all is thrown into high relief by some striking interval. We find no pause just where we would expect one. Thus every stroke that Bach makes in order to bring out the musical form of the phrase is, considered by itself, incomprehensible. Nor would it be difficult to show that in some of his recitatives or arias, Bach has sinned here and there against the natural accent. When, however, we look at the piece as a whole, singing the notes with freedom and at the same time with the quantities Bach has allotted to them, we see it in relief, as it were in a kind of acoustical perspective, of which detailed analysis could convey no idea. This art defies narrow scrutiny. It rests on an intuitive appreciation of the cooperation of the details, the total effect of which is seen by the composer at a glance. It follows that there is no surer way of destroying Bach's effect than the false artistic freedom which many singers, perplexed by the many strangenesses of the music, permit themselves in order to remedy the "chance" quality of the notes that Bach has written. Bach converts into tone not only the body but the soul of the verbal passage. This is clearly seen in his harmonizations of the chorales. The greatest masters of the chorale piece, Eckhard, Pretorius, and others, harmonized the melody. Bach harmonized the words. For him, the chorale melody by itself is indefinite in character. It only acquires a personality when allied with a definite text, the nature of which he will express in his harmonies. Weber long ago saw that the chorale movements of the cantatas and passions are not purely musical. Bach's son, Philipp Emanuel, had published them without the corresponding texts. He had no perception of his father's poetic intentions. His idea was simply to give the world a collection of examples of the chorale movement at its best. At the beginning of the 19th century, when Abbot Vogler's mathematical aesthetic system of harmony was exciting general admiration, Weber, his pupil, thought he owed it to the honor of his teacher to show that he had also surpassed old Bach in the chorale movement, going more systematically to work than the cantor, the astonishing thing being that the latter, without knowing Vogler's system, should have written such rich harmonies. With this end in view, he compares 12 of Bach's harmonizations with 12 corresponding ones by Vogler, and demonstrates that the old master is inferior to the new one, many of his strange harmonic progressions having no raison d'être. Footnote: George Joseph Vogler was born at Würzburg in 1749, studied music and theology in Italy, became a priest in Rome, and settled in 1775 in Mannheim, where he founded a school of music. Later he lived in Paris, Stockholm, and London. In 1807 he became Hofkapellmeister at Darmstadt, where he founded a music school that was attended by Weber and Meyerbeer. He died in 1814. End footnote. To put this down to Weber's lack of judgment would be wrong, as his views were quite just. From the standpoint of pure music, Bach's harmonizations are wholly enigmatic, for he does not work upon a tonal succession that in itself forms an aesthetic whole, but he follows the lead of the poetry and the verbal expression. How far he lets these take him from the natural principles of pure composition may be seen from his harmonizations of Soll's ja so sein, das Straf und Pein in the cantata Ich elender Mensch, wer wird mich erlösen, No. 48, which as pure music is indeed intolerable, Bach's purpose being to express all the wild grief for sin that is suggested in the words. The fault lay with Philip Emanuel, who published the chorale movements without their texts, thereby showing that he did not understand the nature of his father's art. A great service was therefore done to Bach by the Berlin choral conductor Ludwig Erck, 1807 to 1883, when he published the preludes with the verses to which the composer had set the melodies. Footnote. The work has been frequently reprinted. The chorales have lately been translated into French with fine understanding by Albert Mahot, and published with an enthusiastic preface by Vincent Landy. End footnote. If we take Erck's collection and examine the successive arrangement of the same melody, we see that they assume all kinds of characters according to the poetic harmonization. A broad, victorious melody in the major is pursuing its course, when suddenly a theme of mourning enters and dominates it. What majesty the Passion melody, Herz liebst du Jesu, was hast du verbrochen, assumes in the St. Matthew Passion, when it expresses the words, Ach großer König, groß zu allen Zeiten. The quaver sequence in the bass, which is inexplicable from the standpoint of pure music, is the triumphal chariot that carries it. We may say that in Bach's chorales every line, every word is painted, and thrown into a kind of embossed relief. Wagner once remarked of one of his modulations that at first sight seemed too daring and abrupt, that in reality it was not so, since it originated in the meeting of two motives that had already been heard frequently, and that the ear, knowing these, would take into the almost extravagant harmony as something quite natural. Bach in his chorales works on a similar principle. The melody is familiar, he can therefore permit himself the most audacious harmony, the ear being in no danger of missing the continuity of the melody. The poetic significance of Bach's chorale pieces, however, is only fully seen when the choir sings not the melody but the text, emphasizing not the melodic accents but the words that Bach has so strongly, sometimes even too strongly, underlined in his harmonies. The more we examine these chorales, the more we become conscious of the suppressed passion of expression there is in them, to which there is no parallel anywhere in literature. Only a few of Bach's chorale pieces for the organ have come down to us, but those we have suffice to show us his method of working. Footnote. Breitkopf's catalogue of 1764 mentions a complete chorale book of 240 familiar Leipzig melodies with the through bass written out in the notes, by Johann Sebastian Bach, priced at 10 thalers. This book of chorales is lost. In Schemelli's Gesangbuch of 1736, some of Bach's figured basses are given. They may have been taken from his Leipzig chorale book. See Spitta 3, 109 ff. We further possess some harmonizations that have been preserved in copies made by Bach's pupils. They are included in the Peters edition of the chorale preludes. End footnote. When the Arnstadt consistory remonstrated with him for exceeding his leave of absence, the opportunity was at the same time taken to rebuke him for his too temperamental chorale accompaniments. Point out to him, so the report runs, quote, that in the chorales he has made many curious variations and mingled many strange tones with them so that the congregation was confused thereby. End quote. We can understand this censure when we look at the harmonization of In Dulce Jubilo, Peters 5, No. 103. That was intended to accompany the congregational singing. It mattered nothing that Bach filled the breath pauses between the lines of the melody with passage work. That was the common practice of the time. But when the melody enters again, it disappears into the harmonic flood. We must of course remember that as the congregational singing was led by the choir, Bach could permit himself a little freedom. In this Sturm und Drang, the poetic tendency is already revealed. In the chorale Von Himmelhoch da komm ich her, Peters 5, 106, that Krebs has preserved for us, the interlacing and surrounding of the melody by joyous scale passages is explained by the fact that Bach was depicting the angels of heaven referred to in the poetry. A characteristic feature of the chorale movements of this youthful period is the piled-up masses of chords, with their comparative disregard of any strict leading of the voices. His style of accompaniment in his mature period may be seen in Herrgott dich loben wir, Peters 6, page 65 to 69, where every verse is treated independently. The harmonies are clarified in the writing contrapuntal, but, compared with modern chorale accompaniment, unusually animated throughout and over-rich in passing notes. The poetic intention is perfectly evident. Anything characteristic in the text is immediately depicted in the music. Observe the majestic crotchet motion in all the voices from the moment when the words Den göttliche Macht und Herrlichkeit enter, page 66, bar 8 ff, in the chromatic motive of grief that enters with the words Nun hilf uns Herr, page 67, bar 19 ff, the reference being to the death agonies of Jesus. The line Hilf deinem Volk, page 67, bars 39 ff, is illustrated by means of a rhythm which in the cantatas and chorale preludes expresses peace, simply because the word singen occurs here. Immediately afterwards we have the Bach motive of joy, page 68, bar 6 ff, as the text refers to the celestial delight. Later, page 69, bar 13 ff, the sorrowful yearning prayer Zeig uns deine Barmherzigkeit, show us thy compassion, is expressed in trembling chromatics. Finally, at the words Auf dich hoffen wir, lieber Herr, in thee, dear Lord, is our hope, page 69, bars 23 ff, the rhythm of peace returns that was employed in the lines Hilf deinem Volk, Herr Jesu Christ, and seine was dein Erteil ist. Anyone who has the least acquaintance with the intentions of Bach's methods of expression will find that he has reproduced in his music, with speaking fidelity, the salient points of the text. A study of the text along with the chorale harmonizations will show how closely interdependent tone and word are in Bach. The full influence of the poetry upon the music, however, can be seen only in the chorale preludes and the cantatas, where the musical painting is more self-dependent. It goes without saying that Bach seizes the poetic mood in its finest nuances. We can fully apply it to Wagner's remark that music should express the inexpressible, the very root of the poetic idea, the expression of which is beyond the power of verbal speech that is too intellectual for the purpose. End of chapter 21, part 1.